Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a serious plunge into some really fascinating, dense source material.
We are. We're looking at excerpts from Edward Gibbon's, well, frankly, monumental work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
And specifically Volume 3, right? Covering roughly 1185 to 1453.
That's the one. And even just in these sections, Gibbon lays out what was, truly a massive pivot point in history.
Oh, yeah.
Empires transforming, new powers rising dramatically, and the whole relationship between East and West just fundamentally shifting.
Exactly. So our mission today, using these sources as our guide, is to pull out those, vital nuggets of knowledge, the facts that really jump off the page.
Help you get a clearer picture of this incredibly complex time.
Right. Without getting totally lost in the weeds. We've got sources here touching on the rise of Turkish powers, Seljuks, Ottomans, the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire's own struggles, both internal and external.
The papacy's role evolving.
Yeah, its growing power. And even how knowledge itself started moving westward. It's a lot.
It really is a period packed with drama and huge consequences across vast areas.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And maybe we should start with those shifting sands of power, particularly the rise of Turkish influence that comes up early in the sources.
Makes sense. The Seljuk Turks really seem to kick things off here in this period.
Right.
Gibbon notes their revolt against figures like Mahmud, and he describes their time of, well, significant power and magnificence, especially under Malik Shah.
And their expansion was pretty dramatic.
Hugely dramatic, pushing deep into Asia Minor, into Syria, a massive shift.
And this wasn't just about grabbing land, was it? It had massive ripples, particularly for religion and politics. Jerusalem, for instance.
Precisely. Their control over Jerusalem became a major flashpoint.
Yeah.
It really changed things for Christian pilgrims heading to the Holy Land. And frankly, that changed environment was a huge motivator, a key spark that helped ignite the Crusades back in the West.
Okay, so while the Seljuks are reshaping the map out east, what about the venerable but definitely struggling Byzantine Empire? The sources give us glimpses of their complex relationship with these neighbors.
Yeah, the Byzantines were constantly adapting, fighting for survival. The sources actually spend some time detailing their military setup, their capabilities.
Like what?
Well, we get descriptions of their naval forces, for instance.
Yeah.
Not just that they had galleys, but details on their offensive weapons, how they use signals, flags, lights.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and there's even a specific note about the immense financial cost of something like the Crete expedition.
Ah.
It really gives you an insight into the sheer expense of keeping that navy going.
That financial detail, wow. It shows maintaining power wasn't just troop numbers, it was economic strain, too.
Absolutely. But even with the sophisticated military, they face huge challenges.
From multiple directions, I imagine.
Huge challenges, yeah. Think about the siege of Amorium by Motassem, the Abbasid Caliph. The sources describe an incredibly stubborn defense. 55 days they held out.
55 days.
But what ultimately broke the city wasn't just the attacker's force. It was treachery from inside.
No kidding.
Yeah, a domestic traitor apparently pointed out a weak spot on the wall.
Wow. So an internal betrayal did what external force couldn't.
Exactly. It really highlights how internal stability, or the lack of it, was just as critical as external defense for the Byzantines.
And the aftermath.
Horrific, according to the sources. Terrible losses on both sides, mass slaughter, thousands taken captive.
Grim.
But, it's not a simple story of just decline. The Byzantines did have moments of resurgence. Leaders like Nicephorus, John Zimisces, they led aggressive campaigns.
Pushing back.
Definitely. Pushing back into Cilicia, Syria, even launching attacks that threatened Baghdad itself.
So they could still project power with the right leadership. And it wasn't just Turks and Byzantines in the mix, right? Other groups were making waves across Europe, too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention the Hungarian invasions into Europe. Remarkably, they were sometimes even invited in.
Invited?
Yeah, by figures like Arnulf of Germany, though he probably regretted that pretty quickly. Their cavalry raids were incredibly fast and effective. Devastating.
How so?
There's a description of them basically stripping bare a 50-mile area in a single day. Just illustrates their speed and impact.
Wow.
And this whole period of raids is even credited with prompting the widespread building of walled towns in German states. People were desperate for protection.
Walled towns is a direct response to fast cavalry raids. That's a really concrete example of military threats reshaping society.
It is. And another group the sources highlight are the Varangians.
Ah, the
Right,
mercenaries.
Scandinavian mercenaries, a really crucial part of the Byzantine Guard. But what's particularly interesting is the mention of reinforcements coming from English and Danes from Thule.
Ooh, meaning.
Well, Gibbon applies it to England in this context. It just shows the flow of people, military skills, across seemingly disconnected regions.
From mercenaries crossing continents to the origins of urban defense. It really paints a picture of a highly interconnected, dynamic, frankly, pretty violent world.
Very much so.
Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit and dive into the Islamic world as the sources describe it, starting maybe with the Arabian heartland.
Sure. The sources paint a really vivid, stark picture of Arabian geography.
Hmm.
This boundless level of sand, interrupted only by these sharp, naked mountains,
Right.
contrasting sharply with these small, intensely fertile spots, the oases. It really emphasizes that fundamental struggle against the environment, the constant search for water, for fire.
That contrast sounds like a truly challenging place to forge an empire. What about the character of the ancient Arabs themselves, as Gibbon sees them?
He attributes virtues like courage, independence, patience, sobriety, notes their eloquence,
Mm.
and how cities like Mecca and Medina essentially function like commonwealths,
Mm.
governed more by influence and integrity than strict inherited authority.
And this freedom, this boldness it carried over.
It did, initially. This sense of freedom and bold language is noted as carrying through to the early caliphs. But that seems to have changed.
How so?
Well, according to the sources, once the empire center moved east to the Tigris, the Abbasid dynasty adopted a much more elaborate, proud, even pompous ceremonial style.
Ah, influenced by neighbors.
Heavily influenced, yeah, by the Persian and Byzantine courts they now bordered or ruled over, a definite move away from that earlier, simpler style.
Speaking of the early expansion, the sack of Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, the sources have some incredible details there.
Oh, yes. The treasures found were just immense, almost unimaginable. And the sources include these wonderful, slightly quirky anecdotes.
Like what?
Like how camphire, this fragrant resin from the Indian Ocean, was mistaken for salt.
For salt.
Yeah, mixed into bread. Apparently, it astonished the Arab soldiers with its bitterness.
Chuckle slightly. I can imagine.
And then there's that famous story of Omar, the caliph, and the priceless silk carpet.
The one depicting a garden?
That's the one. Intricately embroidered with precious stones, gold, meant to look like a paradise garden. But Omar, being rigidly ascetic, ordered it cut up and distributed.
Destroyed the artwork.
Destroyed the artwork, yes, but the materials alone were incredibly valuable. Ali's share, just one piece, apparently sold for 20,000 drams.
Oh, camphire mistaken for salt, destroying priceless art. These little details really bring the vast scale of conquest down to a human, sometimes even slightly absurd level.
But they do. What about the conquest of Egypt? That's another major event.
Right, led by Amru.
Amru, yeah. Described in the source as one of the first and most spirited figures among the early Muslims. His background noted as interesting, maybe even a bit scandalous, but his military success was undeniable.
Well, the sources mention some almost legendary tales.
Oh, yeah, those fascinating anecdotes, probably legendary, like the Nile supposedly not rising until a mandate from the caliph was symbolically thrown into it. And there's a great contrast in the numbers given for Egypt's population and revenue. You get these wild, extravagant estimates, 20,000 cities versus more reasonable ones.
Yeah.
Or huge sums of gold versus much smaller, likely more accurate figures.
So even in these old accounts, you see that need to be a bit skeptical about the numbers bandied about. Good reminder.
Definitely.
Now, these early conquests, they happened under relatively unified leadership, didn't they? But the caliphate eventually fragmented.
It did, significantly.
Hmm.
The sources highlight the revolt of the Abbasids, led by Abu Muslim, against the ruling Umayyad dynasty. A huge internal power struggle within the Islamic world.
And that led to a pretty remarkable escape story, didn't it? And the creation of a whole separate power center in the West.
The story of Abdul Rahman. Yeah, quite something. A young Umayyad prince who miraculously escaped the Abbasid purge.
Fled across continents.
Fled from the Middle East, across North Africa, eventually making his way to Spain. And there, somehow, he managed to establish Umayyad rule in Cordova.
Creating a Western caliphate.
Exactly. A Western caliphate that lasted for over 2.5 centuries. And what's truly remarkable, often overlooked perhaps, is that this Western caliphate in Spain was often quite friendly with Christian powers.
Really? Like who?
Constantinople, even France at times. standing in stark contrast to the often hostile relationship between the Eastern Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantines.
That's a fantastic example of how the Islamic world wasn't just this single unified bloc, even religiously, politically.
Far from it. By the 10th century, the sources tell us you had three distinct caliphs: Baghdad, Cairoan in North Africa, Cordova in Spain,
Three separate caliphs.
and they even went as far as excommunicating each other. Really underlines the deep political and religious divisions that emerged after that initial rapid expansion.
Which brings us, well, rather directly to those often violent interactions between the Islamic world and the West, particularly the Crusades, and those long-standing tensions embodied by the church schism.
Yeah, the Crusades are maybe the most dramatic manifestation of that East-West conflict in this period. The sources touch on the First Crusade's initial successes.
Right, capturing key cities.
Nice. Antioch and ultimately Jerusalem. They mention figures like Godfrey of Bouillon becoming the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Though he didn't call himself king.
No, it chose the title Defender and Baron of the Holy Sepulchre. And there's that note about the Battle of Ascalon, too, comparing Turkish valor favorably against perceived Egyptian effeminacy.
But the later Crusades, they seem to run into more trouble, especially dealing with the Byzantine Empire itself.
Absolutely. The Second and Third Crusades had notoriously difficult relations with Byzantine emperors like Alexius, Manuel, Isaac Angelus.
Difficult how?
Well, the sources detail instances of hostility, outright treachery, reports of crusaders being given poisoned food.
Poisoned food. Seriously.
According to the accounts, yeah. And even being attacked by Byzantines within Byzantine territory. Meanwhile, the sources note, the Greeks were often secretly allied with the very Turkish and Saracen powers the crusaders were supposedly there to fight.
So deep mistrust, double dealing, between the Christian West and the Christian East, even when facing a common enemy.
Precisely. And the papacy played a huge role in pushing these movements, didn't it?
Definitely. Pope Innocent III, particularly, is highlighted, a figure of immense power, influencing kings, emperors across Europe.
The sources note his big role in promoting later crusades, like the Fourth and Fifth. But this era also saw that fateful diversion of the Fourth Crusade.
The one that ended up sacking Constantinople itself.
Exactly, a pivotal, devastating event for Byzantium. And then the failure of the Fifth Crusade in Egypt.
And the whole idea of crusading seemed to broaden out during this time, beyond just the Holy Land.
It really did. The sources illustrate how the concept started being applied against other groups. Pagans in the Baltic region, Moors in Spain.
And even other Christians.
Yeah, Christian heretics in Europe, like the Albigensians in southern France. The definition of who could be targeted by a crusade definitely expanded.
And underlying so much of this tension, this violence between East and West, was that deep, deep split between the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches.
That religious division, yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't just theology. It had profound political, social consequences. The sources point to specific moments like the mutual excommunications back in the 11th century involving Patriarch Michael Cerularius as really solidifying that break.
And the sources contain some truly shocking accounts of how that religious and cultural tension could just explode into violence.
They really do. The massacre of Latins living in Constantinople during the rise of Andronicus Comnenus, it's described with horrifying detail.
What happened?
The sources state the Greeks indiscriminately slaughtered resident strangers, merchants, clergy, everyone, burned their quarters of the city, sold thousands into slavery.
Just horrifying.
And there's a particularly grim, unforgettable detail. The head of a Roman cardinal apparently being cut off, fastened to a dog's tail, and dragged through the streets.
Oh my God.
The survivors who fled carried these tales of Greek vices, as Gibbon puts it, perfidy, malice back to Italy and Western Europe, just cementing that animosity further.
That level of brutality, it's hard to fathom, really emphasizes how deep the hatred could run. So, while the Christian world is divided, struggling internally, new powers are consolidating. Which leads us to the rise of the Ottoman Turks.
Exactly. The Ottomans emerged from the descendants of the Seljuks and just rapidly grew, became the dominant force in Asia Minor, and then beyond.
Key figures mentioned.
Orkhan, yes, and subsequent chieftains. The sources detail their conquests. This period saw the fall, the desolation of most of those famous 7 churches of Asia from the Book of Revelation.
Most, but not all.
Right. Philadelphia is specifically noted as a remarkable exception, held out with incredible resilience for 80 years against Turkish pressure.
80 years. Amazing. And the Ottomans developed this military system that was both incredibly effective and, well, from our viewpoint today, Pretty chilling in how it started.
The Janissaries, yes.
Oh.
The sources describe this system. Christian boys from conquered lands taken as a form of tax.
Tribute.
Taken from their families, converted to Islam, trained rigorously from a young age in Turkish language, combat, molded into this elite military force.
Wow.
Described in the sources as a servile class, or even an artificial people. Their sole loyalty was meant to be to the Sultan. It was a brutal system, tearing families apart to create dedicated soldiers.
Taking children as tribute to build your army. That is a stark illustration of Ottoman power and control. But even the rising Ottomans faced disruption, right? The sources bring in Timur, or Tamerlane.
Right. Timur's invasion from the east was this massive, though ultimately temporary, setback for the Ottomans. The sources describe the Battle of Ankara.
A huge defeat for the Ottomans.
A crushing defeat. The Ottoman Sultan, Bajazet, was captured by Timur.
And the sources we have here, they give a different account of Bajazet's treatment than that really famous, dramatic Iron Cage story, don't they?
They do. Modern historians, looking at accounts like the Persian history Gibbon also consulted, tend to view the Iron Cage as a later fable, maybe propaganda.
So what do these sources say?
They describe Timur receiving Bajazet with a mix of reproach, but also pity. He initially offered promises of restoring him to his throne, even returned Bajazet's son and wife. Although the wife was required to embrace Islam, Bajazet was kept captive, yes, and died under guard. But these sources don't depict that extreme cruelty of the cage legend.
So perhaps a more nuanced, though still obviously tragic, and for Bajazet, based on these historical accounts. Timur's departure, though, that left the Ottomans in chaos.
It did. Plunged the empire into a civil war. Bajazet's sons were all vying for control.
But someone eventually came out on top.
One son, Muhammad, eventually emerged victorious. And the sources credit him with spending 8 dedicated years just restoring the monarchy, reunifying the Ottoman state after all that turmoil.
And while the Ottomans were regrouping, the Byzantine Empire was in its final desperate struggle. Emperors were looking west again for aid.
Increasingly desperately, yes. Figures like John VIII Palaeologos made these highly controversial journeys. The sources detail his attendance at the Council of Florence.
Where he agreed to church union.
Under immense pressure, yes. Hoping for military support, he formally acknowledged papal supremacy, a move that caused absolute outrage back in Constantinople among the clergy, the populace.
There's that remarkable, almost humiliating anecdote about his visit to the Pope mentioned in the sources, too.
Yeah, the sources recount acts of submission, like the emperor kissing the Pope's feet, even leading the Pope's mule during a procession.
Really trying to show deference.
Exactly, trying to secure that crucial Western aid. But ultimately, it failed. The sources even note his humiliating detention in Venice on the way back because he couldn't pay his debts.
Wow, and the reaction back home in Constantinople to the union agreed at Florence sounds incredibly strong. Negative.
Oh, intense. The sources describe the Greek clergy who'd attended the council deeply regretting it, feeling they'd been forced by circumstance.
Saying things like,
Expressing sentiments like, may the hand that signed the union be cut off, or may the tongue that pronounced the Latin creed be torn out. It just shows how deeply that religious and cultural divide was felt, even when facing an existential threat.
And the military efforts from the West, they didn't pan out either in the long run.
No. The ill-fated Varna Crusade is a prime example, led by Ladislaus of Poland and Hungary.
What went wrong there?
Well, the sources highlight the role of the cardinal legate, Julian, who apparently encouraged the Christian forces to break a recently signed treaty with the Turks.
Break a treaty.
Yeah, this act of perceived perjury, it caused many volunteers, disillusioned, to just leave the army, severely weakening it right before it was decisively defeated by the Ottomans at Varna.
A sad tale of, what, faith and broken promises leading straight to disaster.
Seems that way. Amidst all this, we also hear about figures like Skanderbeg, the Albanian prince.
Right? A fascinating figure.
Truly fascinating in the sources. An Albanian noble, served in the Ottoman court and army, but then revolted.
And the way he started his rebellion was pretty audacious.
Incredibly audacious. The sources describe him extorting a document from a Turkish scribe, basically a dagger point granting him governorship of Albania.
Just like that.
And then murdering the scribe and his companions immediately after to stop the news getting out too quickly. This act sparked widespread Albanian resistance, uniting behind him to fight the Ottomans.
A dramatic, even ruthless way to kick off a rebellion. Okay, so all these threads, Ottoman resurgence, Byzantine desperation, failed Western aid, they all converge towards the final act for the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman preparations for the siege of Constantinople under Muhammad II.
Muhammad II absolutely fixated on taking the city, and the sources give specific detail about his acquisition of that colossal cannon.
It's a super gun.
Basically, yeah, built by a Hungarian or maybe Dane founder who'd actually defected from the Greeks because they apparently failed to reward him adequately.
Oh, the iron.
Right. And the sources describe its truly stupendous size. The weight of the stone ball, over 600 pounds. The earth-shaking test explosion that could be felt, heard for miles around.
That's a game changer of a weapon for that time.
Absolutely. And the sources detail the massive logistical effort just to transport it to the city walls. 30 wagons, 60 oxen, apparently. This wasn't just another piece of artillery. It symbolized a whole new era of siege warfare.
And then came the siege itself, 1453.
Yeah. The sources note the internal discord among the Christian defenders, a persistent theme, really, throughout the empire's final decades.
And Muhammad offered terms.
He did, before the final assault. Conversion to Islam, payment of tribute, or death. The emperor, Constantine XI, famously refused to surrender.
In the aftermath.
Brutal. The sack of the city. The enslavement of, while an estimated 60,000 inhabitants. The sources include these heart-wrenching personal stories, like the historian Franza. He was enslaved with his family. Later ransomed his wife, but his children were taken into Muhammad's service. His son reportedly chose death over dishonor.
Just tragic.
Yet, in a strange contrast, Muhammad also apparently released a Greek noblewoman and her daughters after receiving an elegant Latin ode from some scholar. And the papal legate, Cardinal Isidore, he managed to escape in disguise.
The sheer scale of the loss, the personal tragedies, but also these odd moments of maybe calculated mercy. It brings the human cost of the empire's fall into really sharp focus. But was anything preserved from the city's legacy amidst all that destruction?
Well, the sources note that while the physical city was devastated, its material treasures plundered or destroyed, there was a significant flight of knowledge.
Knowledge? How so?
Greek scholars, fearing oppression under Ottoman rule, emigrated, particularly to places like Italy.
And this exodus, it had a broader impact on Europe.
The sources definitely suggest so. These emigrants brought the lights of the Greek church and the oracles of the Platonic philosophy westward, as Gibbon puts it. They taught their language, brought valuable manuscripts.
So knowledge found a way.
It's presented that way. Knowledge finding a way to survive, to move, contributing, as many historians argue, to the burgeoning Renaissance in Italy. The sources phrase it vividly. The arms of the Turks undoubtedly pressed the flight of the Muses.
That's a powerful way to put it, that even out of destruction, something vital was carried forward, contributing to a new flowering elsewhere. So, okay, we've traveled through centuries of conflict, adaptation, dramatic shifts in power, all guided by these insights from the historical sources, particularly Gibbon's detailed accounts. From the sands of Arabia to the final moments at the walls of Constantinople. We've seen the rise of new forces, the struggle of old empires, the complex, often violent interactions between different cultures, different religions.
It's a period marked by immense destruction and loss, absolutely. But also, as you said, moments of incredible resilience, ingenious adaptation, and that surprising mobility of knowledge.
Knowledge, like people, finding a way to move, to survive amidst the chaos. As you reflect on this deep dive, this whole era, what stands out most to you?
I think it's the constant, almost dizzying interconnectedness of it all.
Yeah.
How internal religious disputes like the schism,
Right.
vast military campaigns like the Crusades, the rise of totally new military systems like the Janissaries, the emergence of powers like the Ottoman, they weren't isolated things.
No.
They were deeply intertwined threads in this incredibly complex tapestry that fundamentally redrew the map, destroyed old orders, and crucially set the stage for the world that came next.
The fall of Constantinople wasn't just an endpoint for an empire. It was a catalyst, wasn't it? Rippling outwards, forcing Europe to look in new directions, find new routes, engage with the world differently.
Absolutely. It truly marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The sources really show us the threads of that huge transformation.
A powerful thought to leave you all with. Maybe consider how these seemingly distant conflicts and power shifts might still echo in subtle or not so subtle ways in the relationships and regions of the world today.
Worth thinking about.
Indeed. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep exploring.